Monkees first toured Australia in 1968, fans were hospitalised for hysteria. And 50 years later, the fans of the Monkees are just as passionate. Michael Nesmith and Micky Dolenz.
The Monkees were once America's answer to Beatlemania, selling millions of records, topping charts, and capturing the hearts of an entire generation. But behind the hit songs and the playful TV smiles were tensions that never fully healed, choices that split the band apart, and wounds that followed them for decades. And when the talk of a reunion came years later, Micky Dolenz's hesitation revealed a truth that still shocks fans today. Micky Dolenz's rise to fame. The Monkees were more than a TV band. They became a cultural force in the 1960s, selling millions of records and defining a generation of pop music. Their impact was so powerful that fans often forgot the group itself had been pieced together for television. But most fans never realized that behind the fame and the catchy songs, tensions brewed. Surprisingly, some of the tensions that later defined the Monkees didn't appear out of nowhere. They had roots in the personal lives of the band members, and Micky Dolenz in particular was shaped by his early life, his struggles, and even the way he learned to play music. George Michael Dolenz Jr., better known to the world as Micky Dolenz, was born on March 8, 1945, in Los Angeles, California, and right from the very beginning, show business was in his blood. His father, George Dolenz, was an actor best known for playing Edmond Dante in the television series The Count of Monte Cristo. His mother, Janelle Johnson, also appeared in films during the 1940s, including the horror movie The Brute Man. Growing up in a household surrounded by cameras, scripts, and auditions, Micky was exposed early on to both the glamour and the pressures of Hollywood life. But childhood for Micky was not as simple as it might have appeared from the outside. At a young age, he was diagnosed with Perthes disease, a rare condition that affects the hip joint. In Micky's case, it caused his right leg to grow weaker and shorter than the other. For a boy who loved movement and play, this was a heavy challenge. Yet instead of letting it stop him, Micky adapted. When he later sat behind a drum kit, the condition shaped his unique playing style. He became right-handed on the drums but used his left foot for the bass pedal, an unusual technique that gave his drumming a distinct rhythm. What could have been a setback ended up shaping his musical identity in ways that fans and fellow musicians would notice for years to come. Surprisingly, Micky's first big break in entertainment didn't come from music but from acting. In 1956, he was cast in the television series Circus Boy, where he performed under the stage name Mickey Braddock. He played Corky, a young orphan who traveled with a circus and worked as a water boy for the elephants. For 3 years, Micky lived a life most kids could only dream of, starring in a popular TV show, meeting celebrities, and working with animals on set. The series made him a familiar face to television audiences, but it also gave him valuable experience in front of the camera, something that would prove vital later when the Monkees came calling. Even as he gained early fame, Micky kept one foot in the everyday world. He attended Ulysses S. Grant High School in the San Fernando Valley, graduating in 1962. Unlike many child stars who abandoned education for full-time careers, he took his studies seriously. After high school, he studied architecture and theater at Los Angeles Technical Institute and Valley College. For a time, it looked like Micky might pursue a practical career as an architect, but music kept pulling him in another direction. In the early 1960s, Micky began playing in local bands and exploring the rock and roll sound that was sweeping through Los Angeles at the time. He formed his own group called Micky and the One-Nighters, playing small gigs and honing his stage presence. Music became more than a hobby. It was his passion. During this period, Micky often covered rock and roll classics, and one of his favorite songs to perform was Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good. That song would later prove to be important in his career, as it was the piece he chose to sing at his audition for The Monkees. His energetic performance of Berry's classic hit impressed the producers and helped secure him a spot in the band that would soon take over the charts. Micky also tried to make a mark as a solo recording artist. In 1965, he recorded 2 singles, Don't Do It and Huff Puff. These songs, however, didn't find their way to the public right away, when Micky was already a household name thanks to the success of the Monkees. By the time those tracks were finally issued, Fans were eager for anything connected to Micky, and they became interesting footnotes in his career, evidence of the work he had been doing before his big breakthrough. But no one, not even Micky, could have predicted how big the next chapter of his life would be when he auditioned to become part of one of the most famous bands of the decade. And while the Monkees would go on to deliver chart-topping songs and sell millions of albums, the story behind their creation, their battles with control, and the personal struggles among the band members would become as dramatic as anything that ever happened on screen: the Monkees formation. When NBC greenlit a new music-driven sitcom in 1965, producers Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider already had a clear vision in mind. They wanted to capture the same energy that had made the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night such a phenomenon: the humor, the music, and the sense of a band living on the edge of chaos. But instead of waiting for lightning to strike naturally, they decided to manufacture it. The result was a project that would turn into one of the most talked-about musical and television experiments of the decade: the Monkees. The search for the perfect cast was ambitious. More than 400 hopefuls lined up for the auditions, each one eager to be part of this new experiment that promised comedy, music, and television fame all rolled into one. Among the final four selected were Micky Dolenz, who had already spent time in front of the camera as a child actor; Davy Jones, the British heartthrob with Broadway credentials; Michael Nesmith, the tall Texan with a sharp mind for songwriting; and Peter Tork, a folk musician whose laid-back personality rounded out the group. Together, they weren't just chosen to act like a band, they were expected to become one. The show premiered in September 1966, and within months it was a cultural phenomenon. The timing was perfect. America was in the middle of the British invasion, music television was booming, and young audiences wanted something they could call their own. The Monkees gave them exactly that. The series mixed zany comedy with catchy songs, and its influence was quickly recognized. By 1967, it had won the Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series, beating out heavyweight shows that had dominated the decade. But the success wasn't only on television. The Monkees became a chart-topping machine. Last Train to Clarksville stormed the Billboard charts as their debut single and hit #1. Not long after, I'm a Believer and Daydream Believer cemented their place as genuine pop icons. In fact, 1967 alone saw them release 4 consecutive #1 albums, a feat no other American act could match at the time. By the height of their fame, they had sold millions of records worldwide, a staggering number for a band that didn't even exist before a casting call. Behind the scenes, though, there was a complicated reality. The group's role in making the music was limited at first. Session musicians were hired to play the instruments while Dolenz, Jones, Nesmith, and Tork handled vocals. For Micky Dolenz, this meant becoming the voice of the Monkees almost overnight. His distinctive tone powered many of their biggest hits, and his delivery gave songs their unforgettable energy. Still, not everyone in the band was comfortable with being treated like actors who happened to sing. By 1967, tensions were building. Michael Nesmith, in particular, pushed hard for the group to have control over their own music. Eventually, they convinced the producers to let them step into the studio and record as a real band. The result was Headquarters, the first album where the Monkees played their own instruments and took creative charge. It may not have outsold their earlier records, but it proved something far more important. The Monkees weren't just a TV creation. They were musicians in their own right. The transformation from television actors to a functioning band was rare for the time and gave them a legitimacy that critics had long doubted. Yet with that shift came new challenges. Fame had come fast and expectations were high. The very machine that had built their success was now beginning to create fractures within the group. And that's where the cracks begin to show. Because for every chart-topping hit and screaming crowd, life behind the camera was far less perfect than the image on screen. The struggles behind the fame. The Monkees were marketed as America's answer to Beatlemania, a made-for-TV band that somehow became a real-life phenomenon. But while the outside world saw 4 young men living every musician's dream, the reality behind the scenes was far more complicated. The pressures of studio control, the fight for creative freedom, and the toll of sudden stardom all weighed heavily on the group, eventually breaking apart what had seemed like the perfect success story. In the earliest days, the biggest issue was control. Don Kirshner, a powerful music executive nicknamed the Man with the Golden Ear, was brought in to manage the Monkees' music output. Kirshner was experienced, ruthless, and focused on hits above all else. He hired professional songwriters, session musicians, and producers to guarantee chart success. And while this formula worked because the band's first records topped the charts, it left Dolenz, Nesmith, Tork, and Jones with no real say in the music they were releasing. They were singing songs they hadn't chosen, backed by musicians they barely knew. For Michael Nesmith, in particular, this was unacceptable. The breaking point came in 1967 when Kirshner released the group's second album, More of the Monkees, without even consulting the band. The record sold millions, but the band felt humiliated. Not only were they kept in the dark about its release, but the album's cover photo showed them awkwardly modeling clothes from a department store. To the band, it felt like proof that they were being treated as puppets. The backlash was so severe that Kirshner was fired, giving the Monkees the chance to take creative control of their own music for the first time. That decision marked a turning point. Nesmith pushed hard to include his own songs, wanting the band to move away from bubblegum pop and toward more serious rock. Dolenz, while more accepting of the studio system, still supported the idea of the band having more input. The result was Headquarters, an album where they played their own instruments and proved they were more than a manufactured act. Fans and critics took notice, but the internal dynamics of the group were already beginning to strain under the weight of different creative visions. Peter Tork, the most musically trained of the four, soon grew disillusioned. He was passionate about the idea of the Monkees becoming a true band, but he was also exhausted by the constant tension over the group's direction. By late 1968, he decided to leave. His departure was a blow not only to the group's sound, but also to its identity. The show had ended, their movie Head had flopped, and the sense of unity that once defined them was fading fast. 2 years later, in 1970, Michael Nesmith also walked away. He had been pushing the hardest for artistic control, and with the Monkees' popularity waning, he saw a chance to pursue his own vision. Nesmith turned to country rock, founding Pacific Arts, and eventually becoming a pioneer in the development of music videos. His influence on the future of the industry would be enormous, but it also underscored how far he had drifted from the pop world of the Monkees. Meanwhile, Davy Jones faced struggles of his own. Typecast as the charming frontman, Jones found it difficult to escape the image of the teen idol created for him by the show. While he remained a beloved figure among fans, he often struggled financially and never quite found the same level of success outside the group. For him, the fame that had made him a household name also became a trap. As the years went on, health issues added another layer of hardship to the band's story. Peter Tork battled alcoholism for much of his life, a fight that was both public and deeply personal. Later, he was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer, which he fought until his passing in 2019. Michael Nesmith also faced serious heart problems, which grew more severe in his later years before his death in 2021. And Micky Dolenz, who had always been the band's lighthearted presence, was left with the heavy emotional weight of becoming the last surviving Monkee. The Monkees had been created as a television project, but over time they became a symbol of both the possibilities and the pitfalls of fame. They experienced the heights of chart-topping success and the depths of personal and professional conflict. And while they achieved what many thought impossible, the cost was high. Because behind every cheerful chorus and every sunny television moment, there was another story, filled with disputes, disappointments, and decisions that would echo long after the band's peak had ended. The Monkees' Controversies. For all their chart-topping hits and massive popularity, the Monkees were never free from controversy. From the very beginning, critics questioned their legitimacy, and as the years went on, new battles emerged that went far beyond music. The harshest criticism came almost immediately after their television debut. While fans adored them, many in the music world dismissed them as a manufactured band. The nickname, the Prefab Four, was a biting reference to the Beatles, suggesting the Monkees were nothing more than a copycat act assembled by producers. The fact that session musicians played most of the instruments on their early albums only fueled the narrative. Even though Dolenz and the others later fought to prove themselves as a real band by writing songs, playing instruments, and recording their own music, the stigma never completely faded. No matter how many records they sold, that early label followed them throughout their careers. But their struggles with perception didn't stop with the music press. In a surprising twist, the U.S. government also had an eye on them. During the late 1960s, the FBI monitored the Monkees for what it called left-wing political messaging during concerts. Reports claimed that subliminal anti-war and pro-civil rights imagery had been shown on screens at their shows. This was during a period of intense political unrest in America, and even a pop band couldn't escape scrutiny. Decades later, this surveillance came back into the spotlight when Micky Dolenz filed a lawsuit against the FBI in 2022 to gain access to the Bureau's full dossier on the band. That move shocked fans and reminded the public of just how deeply politics and culture had collided during the Monkees' heyday. Another controversial moment came with their 1968 film, Head. Co-written with none other than Jack Nicholson, the movie abandoned the lighthearted style of the television show and dove into surreal, satirical territory. It featured striking images, including Vietnam War footage, and took aim at the music industry, Hollywood, and American society. Audiences expecting the goofy charm of the TV series were bewildered, and the film was a commercial flop. Yet over time, Head developed a cult following, celebrated for its boldness and its willingness to confront heavy themes at the height of the Monkees' fame. Even their music carried more political weight than many realized. Last Train to Clarksville, their debut single, sounded like a typical upbeat pop song, but it carried a subtle anti-Vietnam War message. The lyrics, about a soldier heading off to fight and possibly never returning, revealed a band far more aware of the world around them than critics gave them credit for. While they rarely shouted their politics from the stage, those undertones were woven into their work, adding another layer to their story. All of these controversies complicated the Monkees' legacy. On one hand, they were icons of 1960s pop culture, a group whose songs defined a generation. On the other hand, they were targets of ridicule, government suspicion, and commercial failures that left the band fractured. For Dolenz, who had lived through all of it, these events weren't just moments in history. They were part of the long, winding road that shaped his view of the band and his decisions in later life. And once the spotlight dimmed, the Monkees had to face what all bands eventually do: the question of whether they could hold themselves together after fame, or whether their story was destined to be a cycle of disbandments, reunions, and lingering disputes. And for Micky Dolenz, those choices would become more complicated with every passing year. Disbandment and failed reunions. By 1970, the whirlwind that had lifted the Monkees to fame had finally slowed, and the band came apart. Officially, the Monkees disbanded in 1970, and for a time it seemed like their story had ended. But as with many bands tied so closely to a generation, the Monkees never really went away. Over the following decades, they would reunite again and again, sometimes with great excitement, sometimes with mixed results, and almost always with new tensions waiting beneath the surface. The first major revival came in 1986, when MTV began rerunning old episodes of the Monkees TV show. To everyone's surprise, the reruns sparked a wave of nostalgia that drew in both longtime fans and a younger audience discovering the band for the first time. Dolenz and Peter Tork seized the opportunity and recorded a new single. That was then, This Is Now. The song broke into the top 20, proving that there was still life in the Monkees brand. Yet even in this moment of renewed success, there were signs of trouble. Davy Jones refused to participate in the recording sessions, believing the project didn't reflect his vision of the group. The disagreement created new tensions, and while the tour that followed was successful, it also reminded fans that unity among the Monkees was never guaranteed. A decade later, in 1996, all four members came together again to mark the 30th anniversary of the band. For fans, it was a rare and special sight to see Dolenz, Jones, Nesmith, and Tork sharing the stage once more. But the reunion was short-lived. Michael Nesmith, who had always been reluctant to rejoin the group on a long-term basis, soon stepped away again. His interests were elsewhere, and he made it clear that the old conflicts and creative differences hadn't disappeared with time. Between 2001 and 2011, the Monkees reunited in different forms for a series of tours. Sometimes the lineup included Dolenz, Jones, and Tork. Other times, Nesmith would make an appearance. But the chemistry was never quite the same as it had been in the 60s. The tours were a chance to celebrate their legacy, but behind the scenes the same challenges persisted. Disagreements over direction, clashing personalities, and the growing reality that the band members were living very different lives. But when asked about the band's breakup and frequent reunions, Dolenz clarified the situation by saying, "If you look at the Monkees as a typical classic rock band, you can use words like left and came back. We weren't that though. We were not a group. We were the cast of a TV show. Strictly speaking for myself, that's how it was and always will be." The passing of Davy Jones in 2012 marked a turning point. His death from a sudden heart attack shocked fans and left the group without its most recognizable face. Peter Tork's death in 2019, after a battle with cancer, deepened the sense of loss. And when Michael Nesmith died of heart failure in 2021, it left Micky Dolenz as the last surviving member of the Monkees, a role that carried both pride and heavy responsibility. Before Nesmith's death, he and Dolenz had managed one final tour together in 2021. Billed as The Monkees Present, The Mike and Micky Show, it was meant as both a celebration and a farewell. The shows were emotional, filled with nostalgia and reflection, and they ended only weeks before Nesmith passed away. For many fans, it felt like the true closing chapter of the Monkees as a band. By then, Dolenz had lived through the highs and lows of every reunion, every split, and every comeback attempt. He had seen the joy it brought fans, but he had also endured the frustrations, the compromises, and the heartbreak that came with trying to keep the Monkees alive long after their original moment had passed. And so when talk of another reunion surfaced, Dolenz surprised many by refusing. After decades of carrying the weight of the band's history, he finally drew a line. But his reasons were not simple, and they reached far deeper than the usual explanations of age or fatigue. Why Dolenz said no? By the time Micky Dolenz was faced with the idea of another Monkees reunion, he had lived through nearly every version of what that meant. He had been there for the dizzying heights of their television fame, the bitter splits, the nostalgic comebacks, and the emotional final tour with Michael Nesmith in 2021. But after Nesmith's passing, leaving him the last surviving member, Dolenz made a decision that surprised some fans and deeply resonated with others. He refused. For him, stepping on stage as the Monkees without his bandmates was out of the question. Dolenz explained his reasoning in simple but powerful terms. To call himself the Monkees, he said, would feel wrong. It wasn't just about the name, it was about respect for the group's history. The Monkees had always been about four people, not one, and for Dolenz to carry the name alone would be a disservice to what they had built together. The laughter, the harmonies, the creative fights, and even the controversies had been part of a shared experience. Taking the stage under that banner without Jones, Tork, or Nesmith beside him would feel like pretending, and he had no interest in doing that. Even the way the name was used mattered to him. In the final years, Dolenz and Nesmith had performed under the title The Monkees Present, The Mike and Micky Show. That wording was important. It acknowledged that the performance was part of the Monkees' legacy, but it also made it clear that it wasn't the full band. Dolenz rejected the idea of simply calling a show The Monkees when he was the only one left. He wanted the name to stay tied to the original format and the full lineup, not stretched into something it was never meant to be. There was also the emotional weight of carrying on without his bandmates. Losing Jones in 2012 had been painful enough, but the deaths of Tork in 2019 and Nesmith in 2021 left Dolenz as the last man standing. Each loss was a reminder that the Monkees were no longer a living, breathing band. They were a memory, a legacy preserved in songs, shows, and the hearts of fans. To try to revive that on stage by himself, Dolenz felt, would not only be emotionally draining, but would also strip away the authenticity of what they once had. Instead, Dolenz turned his attention to projects that honored the legacy without trying to replace it. One of his most meaningful undertakings was the album Dolenz Sings Nesmith, a tribute to his longtime bandmate and friend. Through those recordings, he kept Nesmith's voice alive in a way that felt personal and genuine. He also embarked on the Monkees Celebrated by Micky Dolenz tour, where he performed music from his career while sharing anecdotes and memories of the band. These projects allowed him to celebrate the past without blurring the line between what the Monkees had been and what he could carry forward on his own. For Dolenz, it all came back to preserving the integrity of the Monkees' image. He knew that fans still loved the songs, the show, and the memories, and he wanted to keep that intact. By refusing to tour as the Monkees, he was protecting the group's identity from being watered down into a one-man act. In his view, the Monkees were bigger than any single member, even him. And the best way to honor that was to let the name rest with the band as a whole. Right now, Micky Dolenz has nothing left to prove. He had been the voice of many of their greatest hits, the energy behind countless performances, and in the end, the keeper of their story. Saying no to another reunion wasn't about stepping away from the music. It was about making sure that what the Monkees represented remained true, even if it meant closing the door on a part of his own past. Who is your favorite The Monkees band member? Tell us in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates.